June 4, 1942, 4:30 in the morning. Aboard the carrier Akagi, flagship of the First Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo stood on the bridge watching his aircraft prepare for launch, 4 carriers steaming in formation. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. 248 aircraft ready to devastate the American base at Midway Island. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question he couldn't quite silence: where are the American carriers? The operation had been planned with meticulous detail by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself. Midway Island would be attacked and invaded. The American Pacific Fleet, desperate to defend this strategic outpost, would sortie from Pearl Harbor directly into a trap. Japanese submarines would spot them approaching. The carriers would launch their aircraft and destroy the American fleet in open water. It would be a second Pearl Harbor, but this time the American carriers, the ones that had escaped destruction in December, would be sunk. The United States would be forced to negotiate peace. Japan would secure its Pacific Empire. Everything depended on one assumption: that the Americans didn't know the attack was coming. At 4:30, the first wave launched. 108 aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. They formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and turned southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. Nagamo watched them disappear into the distance. On the deck below, the second wave was being armed and fueled, ready to launch against the American carriers when they were finally located. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, stood near Nagamo. He had been grounded due to appendicitis but remained aboard as an observer. Something about the operation troubled him. The reconnaissance plan was inadequate. Only a handful of search planes, large gaps in coverage. If American carriers were out there, they might not be spotted until it was too late. He had mentioned this to Nagamo before the launch. The Admiral had nodded but seemed unconcerned. The submarines were in position. The Americans would be spotted. At 5:34, reports started coming from the Midway strike force. Island defenses alert. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. Fighters intercepting. The Americans at Midway were ready. Not surprised. Ready. As if they had been expecting the attack. On the bridge, Nagumo's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, received the reports with growing unease. He turned to Nagamo. They were prepared. How? Nagumo's expression didn't change. They saw our scout planes, or they detected the strike force on radar. It doesn't matter. We proceed as planned. But Kusaka's concern was deeper. Midway's readiness suggested something more than last-minute detection. It suggested foreknowledge. And if the Americans knew about Midway, what else did they know? At 5:52, the submarine cordon reported nothing. No American ships detected. The carriers should have left Pearl Harbor by now. They should be approaching the submarine picket line, but there was only empty ocean. Nagamo checked the charts again. Yamamoto's plan required the Americans to react predictably, to sortie directly from Pearl Harbor toward Midway along the most direct route. If they deviated from that route, if they took an unexpected path, if they were already at sea before the attack began, the submarines would miss them. Where are they? Nagamo said quietly. Kusaka had no answer. At 7 o'clock, the Midway Strike Force commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, sent a message. Second strike necessary. Midway's facilities were damaged but not destroyed. Hangars burning, fuel stores hit, but the runways were still operational. More importantly, Midway's aircraft had launched before the strike arrived and were now attacking the Japanese fleet. Nagamo made his decision. The second wave, currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, would be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway. It would take at least an hour. Ordnance crews swarmed the hangar decks. Torpedoes were removed from aircraft and replaced with bombs. The process was slow, dangerous, and irreversible. Once committed, the carriers would be vulnerable, unable to launch immediately if American ships appeared. At 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, finally sent a report. 10 ships sighted. Bearing 010 degrees. Distance 240 miles. Nagamo stopped mid-conversation. 10 ships, American ships. In the worst possible location, northeast of the fleet. Exactly where they shouldn't be if they had sortied from Pearl Harbor after the attack began. Kusaka grabbed the message. What types? The message didn't say. Nagamo immediately sent a response. Ascertain ship types. The minutes crawled past. Aircraft were still being rearmed below decks. Torpedoes stacked in passageways. Bombs sitting on trolleys. Fuel lines open. The carriers were powder kegs. At 7:45, the Tone Scout sent an update. Ships appeared to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Kusaka felt relief wash over him. No carriers. Cruisers could be handled. The immediate threat was manageable. But Fukita, standing nearby, felt his stomach tighten. Something was wrong. American cruisers didn't operate alone this far from Pearl Harbor. They escorted something. Nagamo was already issuing orders. Continue rearming for Midway strike. Prepare to deal with surface ships after. Then at 8:09, the message that changed everything arrived. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The bridge went silent. Nagamo stared at the message. A carrier. An American carrier, not approaching from Pearl Harbor. Already in position, northeast of his fleet. In perfect position to strike. Kusaka spoke first. They were waiting for us. Nagamo turned to look at him. His face had gone pale. That's impossible. How could they know? But they did know. That was suddenly terrifyingly clear. The American carrier wasn't racing from Pearl Harbor. It was already here, already positioned, already launching aircraft probably. And Nagamo's carriers were in the worst possible condition. Half his strike aircraft were at Midway, low on fuel, needing to land soon. The other half were on his decks being rearmed, unable to launch. Bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangars, fuel lines open. Every carrier was a floating bomb. Fukita moved closer. Admiral, we need to launch immediately. Anything we have ready. Nagamo looked at his air officer. How long until we can launch a strike against that carrier? The air officer consulted with his staff. If we stop rearming now, reverse the process, put the torpedoes back on. 90 minutes, maybe longer. We have to recover the Midway strike force first. They're returning now, low on fuel. If we don't take them aboard, we lose 100 aircraft. Nagamo was trapped. He couldn't launch a strike without rearming. He couldn't rearm without recovering his Midway aircraft. He couldn't recover aircraft without clearing the flight decks. And every minute he delayed, the American carrier was launching its own strike. Kusaka voiced what everyone was thinking. They knew we were coming. They knew where we'd be. This entire operation, they were waiting for us. How? Nagamo's voice was sharp. How doesn't matter. We deal with what's in front of us. Order the fleet to prepare for air attack, maximum combat air patrol. Get our fighters in the air, launch everything we can. At 8:20, American torpedo bombers appeared, TBD Devastators from the carrier Hornet. 15 aircraft flying low over the water, slow, obsolete, easy targets. Japanese Zero fighters tore into them. One by one, the Devastators were shot down, burning, crashing into the sea. Within minutes, all 15 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit. On the Akagi's bridge, Nagamo watched the massacre. His fighters had performed perfectly, but more attacks would come. Where were the dive bombers? American doctrine called for coordinated attacks. Torpedo bombers low, dive bombers high, hitting simultaneously. But the dive bombers hadn't appeared. The torpedo attack had been piecemeal, uncoordinated, suicidal. At 8:38, more torpedo bombers. This time from Enterprise, 14 aircraft. Again, the Zeros swarmed them. Again, every single American aircraft was shot down. No hits. The Americans were throwing away their planes. Fuchida couldn't understand it. These attacks were suicide, no coordination, no fighter escort in effective numbers. The Americans were better trained than this. Unless something else was happening. At 9:18, the Midway strike force began landing. One by one, aircraft touched down. The flight decks were crowded. Planes being refueled, rearmed, moved below. Ordnance crews working frantically. Bombs still scattered on deck. The carriers were more vulnerable than ever. And that's when the dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey from Enterprise had been searching for the Japanese fleet. His squadrons had flown past where the carriers should have been, found nothing, turned back. They were almost out of fuel, about to return to their carrier. Then McCluskey had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. He followed it, and it led him directly to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:22, 37 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. Nagumo's fighters were all at sea level. They had been slaughtering torpedo bombers for 2 hours. Every Zero was low on altitude and ammunition. There was nothing between the American dive bombers and the Japanese carriers except empty sky. On Akagi's bridge, someone shouted, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo looked up, black shapes dropping from the sun. He opened his mouth to give orders, but there was no time. The first bomb hit Akagi amidships. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where armed aircraft sat wing to wing, where bombs and torpedoes were stacked, where fuel lines were open. The explosion was massive. It tore through the hangar deck, igniting everything. Secondary explosions followed as ordnance cooked off. Within seconds, Akagi was burning from the inside out. More bombs hit Kaga. One struck near the bridge. Another hit the flight deck. Fires erupted. The carrier began to list. Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession. All 3 hit within minutes. The carrier was engulfed in flames almost immediately. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled was destroyed. Not by superior numbers, not by better technology, but by being in the wrong place at the wrong time with their defenses down. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge watching his fleet die. Around him, officers were shouting damage reports, casualty counts, orders to abandon ship, but Nagumo wasn't listening. He was staring at the burning carriers and understanding. They knew. The Americans knew everything, where we'd be, when we'd arrive. They were waiting. This wasn't a battle, it was an ambush. Kusaka grabbed his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. Akagi is lost." Nagumo let himself be led away. As he climbed down to the boat that would take him to a cruiser, he looked back at his flagship. Smoke pouring from her decks, explosions still rippling through her hull. He thought about Yamamoto's plan, the trap they were supposed to spring. And he realized with absolute certainty that they had never been the hunters. From the moment they left Japan, from the moment they set course for Midway, they had been the prey.